In the sterile halls of St. Catherine's Military Hospital, everyone thought they knew Sarah Mitchell, the quiet night nurse who never raised her voice, never complained about double shifts, and somehow always appeared exactly where she was needed most. The Marines recovering from their tour called her Angel because of her gentle touch and calm presence during their darkest moments. What they didn't know was that the woman changing their bandages and monitoring their pain medication had once infiltrated terrorist strongholds in the dead of night, eliminated high-value targets with surgical precision, and survived missions that existed only in classified files. For 2 years, Sarah had successfully buried her past as one of the Navy's most elite SEALs, trading her combat knife for a stethoscope and her tactical gear for scrubs. But on one stormy October night, when armed men breached the hospital's security and threatened the lives of everyone inside, the quiet nurse would have no choice but to reveal who she really was. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as Sarah Mitchell made her rounds through the intensive care unit. It was 2:30 a.m., and the October rain hammered against the windows of St. Catherine's Military Hospital with relentless determination. Most of the staff had grown accustomed to the sound, but Sarah found herself listening to the rhythm, her mind automatically calculating wind patterns and visibility conditions. Old habits died hard, especially when those habits had once meant the difference between life and death in places most people couldn't pronounce. She approached bed 7 where Corporal James Rodriguez lay recovering from shrapnel wounds he'd sustained in Afghanistan 3 weeks prior. His chart showed steady improvement, but Sarah could see the familiar haunted look in his eyes that never quite disappeared, even in sleep. She'd seen that look in mirrors for years before finally learning to bury it deep enough that others couldn't detect it. "Can't sleep again," she whispered, nodding that his eyes were open and staring at the ceiling. Rodriguez turned his head slightly, managing a weak smile. "Hey, Angel, yeah, the dreams keep coming back. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back in that marketplace." Sarah pulled up a chair beside his bed, her movements fluid and silent in a way that most people attributed to years of hospital training. In reality, she'd learned to move without sound long before she'd ever set foot in a medical facility. "Tell me about the good parts of that day. What happened before the explosion?" This was her method. She never pushed the Marines to forget their trauma, but instead helped them find the human moments buried beneath the horror. Rodriguez began describing how he'd shared his rations with a group of local children that morning, his voice growing steadier as he focused on the connection he'd made rather than the violence that followed. As Rodriguez spoke, Sarah's trained ear picked up something else beneath the sound of rain and the steady beeps of medical equipment. Footsteps in the corridor, but not the familiar rhythm of Dr. Patterson making late-night rounds or the quick shuffle of Janet from the night cleaning crew. These steps had the measured cadence of someone trying to move quietly while carrying significant weight. Her body tensed almost imperceptibly, years of survival instincts suddenly alert despite her mind's attempts to rationalize the sound away. "Sarah," Rodriguez had stopped talking, noticing her distraction. "Everything okay?" She forced her attention back to him, offering the same gentle smile that had comforted hundreds of patients over the past 2 years. "Just thought I heard something. Probably Dr. Patterson checking on the surgical ward. Keep talking about those kids. What were their names?" But even as Rodriguez continued his story, Sarah's mind was elsewhere, processing every sound that filtered through the hospital's late-night quiet. The footsteps had stopped, but she could sense a presence in the hallway just beyond her line of sight. It was a feeling she'd learned to trust implicitly during her years of active duty, the same instinct that had saved her life in a village outside Kandahar when she'd sensed an ambush seconds before the first shots were fired. 20 minutes later, after ensuring Rodriguez was comfortable and finally drifting towards sleep, Sarah made her way to the nurse's station. The charge nurse, Linda Hartwell, was absorbed in updating patient charts, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose as she squinted at her computer screen. "Linda, have you seen anyone unusual in the building tonight? Maybe someone from maintenance or security making rounds?" Linda looked up, pushing her glasses up her nose. "Not that I know of. Why, did you see someone?" "Probably nothing. Just thought I heard unfamiliar footsteps near the ICU." Linda chuckled softly. "You know how this old building settles, especially in weather like this. Plus, we've got that new security guard, Marcus, who's still learning his roots. He might be taking a different path than usual." Sarah nodded, accepting the explanation while mentally cataloging the escape routes from their current location. The habit was so ingrained that she did it unconsciously now, the same way other people might count sheep or organize their grocery lists. 3 stairwells within 50 yards, 2 elevators that could be disabled easily, emergency exits on the east and west sides of the building, and the roof access through the maintenance corridor on the 4th floor. The rest of her shift passed without incident, but Sarah remained alert in a way that her colleagues attributed to professional dedication. She moved between patients with her usual quiet efficiency, adjusting medication drips, monitoring vital signs, and providing the kind of compassionate care that had earned her recognition as one of the hospital's most valued nurses. What her colleagues didn't notice were the subtle ways she positioned herself in each room to maintain clear sightlines to exits, or how her eyes automatically scanned for anything that could be weaponized if necessary. At 6 a.m., the day shift began arriving, bringing with them the familiar chaos of shift change. Sarah was in the middle of giving report to her replacement, Nurse Patricia Williams, when the lights flickered. Both women paused, looking toward the ceiling as if the fluorescent bulbs might provide an explanation. "Probably just the storm," Patricia said, but Sarah was already moving toward the window. The rain had intensified, and the wind was strong enough to sway the trees in the hospital's parking lot, but the emergency generators should have prevented any power fluctuations, unless something else was causing the electrical disruption. "I'm going to check with maintenance before I leave," Sarah said, her voice casual despite the alertness now coursing through her system. "Make sure everything's stable for the day shift." Patricia nodded absently, already absorbed in reviewing the patient updates. Sarah made her way toward the elevator, but instead of heading to the parking garage as her colleagues assumed, she pressed the button for the basement level, where the building's main electrical and security systems were housed. As a nurse, she had no official reason to be in that area, but her military training had taught her that understanding a building's infrastructure could be the difference between life and death in certain situations. The basement corridor was dimly lit and empty, lined with pipes and electrical conduits that hummed with the constant power flow needed to keep a modern hospital operational. Sarah's soft-soled nursing shoes made no sound against the concrete floor as she made her way toward the main electrical room. The door was supposed to be locked and accessible only to authorized maintenance personnel, but she found it standing slightly ajar. Every instinct she developed over years of dangerous missions suddenly screamed that something was very wrong. She approached the door with the careful precision of someone who had spent years navigating hostile territory, her body automatically shifting into a combat-ready stance that felt both foreign and familiar after 2 years of suppression. Through the narrow gap in the door, she could see 2 men in maintenance uniforms working on what appeared to be the hospital's main security panel. Their movements were too practiced, too purposeful to be routine repair work. One of them spoke quietly into a radio, his words barely audible but enough for Sarah to catch fragments. "Phase 1 complete. Security cameras offline. Proceed with insertion." Sarah felt her carefully constructed civilian identity begin to crack as the realities of the situation became clear. This wasn't a power fluctuation from the storm. Someone was deliberately compromising the hospital's security systems, and based on the military precision of their operation, this was no random break-in. The patients upstairs, including the dozens of recovering Marines who were too injured to defend themselves, were sitting targets. For the first time in 2 years, Sarah Mitchell allowed herself to think like the Navy SEAL she had once been. She mentally inventoried the tactical situation: unknown number of hostiles, compromised building security, multiple floors of potential victims, and limited time before whatever they had planned moved to the next phase. Her mind automatically began calculating response strategies while her body remained perfectly still, hidden in the shadows of the basement corridor. The 2 men finished their work and moved toward a different section of the basement, their quiet conversation revealing that they were part of a larger team. Sarah waited until they disappeared around a corner before slipping into the electrical room to assess what they had done to the security systems. The damage was extensive but precise, indicating advanced technical knowledge and careful planning. As she studied the disabled cameras and alarm systems, Sarah's mind raced through possible motivations for the attack. St. Catherine's was primarily a military hospital, treating wounded servicemen and women returning from overseas deployments. The patient roster currently included several Marines who had been involved in classified operations, and the hospital also housed medical research facilities that worked on trauma treatments for the Department of Defense. A soft chime from the elevator in the distance indicated that someone was moving between floors, likely the infiltration team advancing to their primary objective. Sarah realized that she was probably the only person in the building who understood the true nature of what was happening, and she faced an impossible choice. She could try to escape and call for help, but by the time law enforcement arrived, whatever these men had planned would already be in motion. Or she could break the promise she had made to herself 2 years ago and become someone she had tried very hard to forget. Standing in the dim light of the electrical room, surrounded by the disabled security systems that were supposed to protect everyone upstairs, Sarah Mitchell felt the careful walls she had built around her past begin to crumble. The quiet nurse who changed bedpans and monitored heart rates was about to disappear, replaced by someone far more dangerous and far more necessary. She moved through the basement corridors with renewed purpose, her mind already shifting into tactical mode as she planned her next moves. The storm outside continued to rage, providing cover for whatever operation was unfolding, but Sarah knew that sometimes the most dangerous storms were the ones that occurred when everyone thought they were safe. Above her, in the fluorescent-lit halls of St. Catherine's Military Hospital, dozens of patients slept peacefully in their beds, unaware that their quiet guardian angel was about to reveal her true nature. The Marines who had nicknamed her Angel had no idea how prophetic that name would prove to be, or that their gentle nurse was about to become their most formidable protector. As Sarah made her way back toward the stairwell, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in a darkened window and barely recognized the person staring back at her. The soft features and kind eyes were the same, but something fundamental had shifted in her posture and expression. For the first time in 2 years, she looked like what she really was, one of the most highly trained and lethal operators the U.S. military had ever produced. The quiet nurse was gone. The Navy SEAL had returned. Sarah moved through the stairwell with the silent precision of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of remaining undetected. Each step was calculated, each breath controlled, as she climbed toward the main hospital floors while her mind processed the tactical situation unfolding around her. The storm outside provided natural cover, but she knew that the men who had infiltrated St. Catherine's were professionals who wouldn't rely solely on weather for concealment. Reaching the first floor, Sarah paused at the stairwell door and listened intently. The normal sounds of hospital activity were notably absent. No rolling gurneys, no hushed conversations between staff members, no pages over the intercom system. The silence was too complete, too artificial for a building that never truly slept. Through the small window in the door, she could see the main corridor illuminated by emergency lighting, casting long shadows that could hide any number of threats. Her mind automatically began cataloging the hospital's layout in tactical terms rather than the familiar nursing routine she had followed for 2 years. The main desk commanded a clear view of both elevators and the primary entrance, making it an ideal control point for anyone wanting to manage movement throughout the building. The medication storage areas contained supplies that could be weaponized by someone with the right knowledge, and the multiple wings and corridors provided both escape routes and potential ambush points. Sarah's reflection was interrupted by the soft sound of voices echoing from somewhere beyond the corridor. She cracked the door open just enough to allow sound to filter through and immediately recognized the controlled, professional tone of military communication. Two voices, speaking in the kind of abbreviated tactical language that civilians would find cryptic, but that she understood perfectly. Overwatch in position on floors 2 and 4. Primary targets confirmed in surgical recovery. Copy that. Medical personnel secured in break room 3. Proceed to phase 3 on my mark. The radio exchange confirmed her worst fears. This wasn't a random attack or even a robbery gone wrong. Someone had specifically targeted St. Catherine's with knowledge of both the building's layout and the current patient roster. The reference to primary targets in surgical recovery made her blood run cold as she realized they were likely referring to the Marines currently recovering from classified missions. Sarah's mind raced through the possibilities. International terrorists seeking revenge against specific military personnel, foreign intelligence operatives attempting to extract information from wounded servicemen, or domestic extremists targeting military facilities. Regardless of their motivation, the tactical precision of their operation indicated extensive planning and resources that went far beyond typical criminal activity. Moving with practiced stealth, Sarah made her way toward the break room area to assess the situation with the captured staff members. If she was going to mount any kind of effective response, she needed to know how many hostiles she was dealing with and what kind of timeline she was operating under. The familiar corridors felt different now, transformed from healing spaces into a battlefield where every shadow could conceal an enemy. As she approached break room 3, Sarah could hear muffled voices through the door. A man speaking with the authority of someone clearly in charge, his tone suggesting he was issuing instructions rather than requests. Through the narrow window in the door, she could see approximately 8 hospital staff members sitting on the floor with their hands secured behind them using zip ties. A single armed guard stood watch, his attention focused on the captives rather than potential external threats. Sarah studied the guard's positioning and equipment with the analytical eye of someone trained to assess tactical situations. He carried what appeared to be a modified assault rifle with a suppressor, wore civilian clothes that couldn't quite conceal body armor underneath, and maintained the kind of alert posture that suggested military or law enforcement training. His placement in the room provided good visibility of the captives, but left him vulnerable to attack from the corridor. The tactical part of Sarah's brain began calculating angles of approach and probability of success for various intervention strategies. She could potentially neutralize the guard quietly, but doing so would likely trigger alarms that would alert the rest of the team to her presence. More importantly, she still didn't know how many operatives were involved or what their ultimate objective was beyond securing the hospital. A soft chime from the elevator system drew her attention back to the main corridor. The doors opened to reveal 3 more armed men moving with the coordinated precision of a military unit. Sarah pressed herself deeper into the shadows, watching as they split up to cover different sections of the building. Their movement patterns and communication protocols confirmed her assessment that these were highly trained professionals rather than opportunistic criminals. As the men disappeared into different areas of the hospital, Sarah found herself facing the kind of impossible decision she thought she had left behind forever. Every instinct developed through years of dangerous missions told her to gather more intelligence before taking action. But the references to primary targets in surgical recovery meant that lives were at immediate risk. The Marines recovering upstairs were completely vulnerable, many of them still sedated or too injured to defend themselves. Sarah made her way toward the surgical recovery ward using routes that avoided the main corridors where the infiltrators were likely to maintain overwatch positions. Her knowledge of the building's service passages and maintenance areas, gained through 2 years of working every shift imaginable, now served a very different purpose than ensuring efficient patient care. The surgical recovery ward occupied the entire 3rd floor, housing patients who required intensive monitoring following major procedures. Currently, it held 12 Marines in various stages of recovery from combat injuries, along with 6 other military personnel from different branches of service. The thought of these wounded warriors being targeted while helpless in their hospital beds filled Sarah with a cold fury that she hadn't felt since her last military deployment. Emerging from a maintenance stairwell near the recovery ward, Sarah immediately noticed that the normal nursing station was empty. The absence of staff in an area that required constant monitoring confirmed that the infiltrators had successfully secured control of the critical areas of the hospital. Through the glass partitions separating the nursing station from the patient rooms, she could see several figures moving between the beds in a manner that suggested they were checking identities rather than providing medical care. Sarah's military training had included extensive work in hostage rescue and counterterrorism operations, and she recognized the methodical approach the infiltrators were taking. They had isolated the target area, neutralized security systems, captured staff members to prevent interference, and were now identifying specific individuals from among the patient population. The level of organization suggested state-sponsored operation rather than independent terrorist activity. Moving with the silence that had once allowed her to infiltrate enemy positions undetected, Sarah positioned herself to observe the activities in the patient rooms. Through the windows, she could see 2 armed men systematically checking medical charts and identification bracelets, while a 3rd maintained overwatch from the corridor. Their focus seemed to center on a particular section of rooms where the most seriously wounded Marines were housed. Room 314 contained Staff Sergeant Michael Chen, who had been injured during a classified operation in Syria that had reportedly eliminated several high-value terrorist targets. Room 316 housed Corporal David Martinez, who had sustained injuries during a rescue mission that had extracted American civilians from a hostile zone. Both men were heavily sedated and completely vulnerable, their heroic service making them attractive targets for enemies seeking either revenge or intelligence. Sarah realized that she was witnessing the opening phase of what could be either an assassination operation targeting specific military personnel or an extraction attempt designed to kidnap individuals with knowledge of classified operations. Either scenario represented a direct threat not just to the immediate victims, but to ongoing military operations and national security interests. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders like familiar combat gear as Sarah acknowledged that she was likely the only person in the building capable of stopping what was happening. The local police would be outgunned and outmaneuvered by operatives of this caliber, and any military response would take too long to prevent immediate harm to the targets. Her carefully constructed civilian identity felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. From her concealed position, Sarah began conducting the kind of tactical assessment that had once been second nature. 3 confirmed hostiles in the immediate area, at least 2 more maintaining overwatch positions on other floors, an unknown number providing security for captured staff members, and possibly additional team members securing perimeter positions or providing external support. Against this force, she had her medical knowledge, intimate familiarity with the building layout, and combat skills that she had spent 2 years trying to forget. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same training which had once made her one of the military's most effective operators now positioned her as the only hope for the wounded Marines sleeping defensively in their hospital beds. The gentle nurse who had spent 2 years healing the psychological wounds left by combat was about to engage in the very kind of violence she had been helping others recover from. Sarah's contemplation was interrupted by radio chatter from the operatives in the patient rooms. Primary target identified in 314. Secondary target confirmed in 316. Prepare for extraction in 15 minutes. The clinical efficiency in the voice chilled her blood as she realized that Chen and Martinez were about to be taken, likely never to be seen alive again. Moving back into the maintenance corridors, Sarah began preparing for a type of mission she had hoped never to undertake again. But as she mentally reviewed the tactical options available to her, she felt the familiar surge of focused determination that had carried her through missions in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. The quiet nurse who had spent 2 years avoiding conflict was about to remind everyone why Navy SEALs were considered among the most elite warriors in the world. The storm outside continued to rage against the windows of St. Catherine's Military Hospital, but inside the building, a different kind of storm was about to begin. Sarah Mitchell was preparing to step out of the shadows and back into a world where the difference between success and failure was measured not in patient recovery times, but in lives saved or lost in the span of heartbeats. As she moved through the service corridors toward a confrontation that would shatter her carefully constructed peaceful existence, Sarah felt the familiar calm that had always preceded her most dangerous missions. The Marines upstairs had called her their guardian angel, and she was about to show them exactly what kind of angel she really was. Sarah moved through the maintenance tunnels beneath St. Catherine's with the fluid precision of someone returning to their natural element. The 2 years of suppressed training and instincts came flooding back as she navigated the building's hidden infrastructure, her mind automatically calculating distances, timing, and tactical advantages with the cold efficiency that had once made her legendary among her SEAL teammates. The hospital's supply rooms provided everything she needed to improvise the tools of her former trade. Medical scissors became close-quarters weapons, cleaning supplies transformed into tactical advantages, and her intimate knowledge of human anatomy gave her capabilities that went far beyond conventional combat training. But more than any improvised weapon, her greatest advantage was that nobody expected the quiet night nurse to be anything more than what she appeared to be. As she positioned herself for the first phase of her counter-operation, Sarah allowed herself a moment to consider the irony of the situation. For 2 years, she had dedicated herself to healing the psychological wounds that combat left on warriors like the Marines sleeping upstairs. Now, she was about to engage in exactly the kind of violence that created those wounds in the first place. But sometimes, she reflected grimly, The only way to protect peace was through the application of controlled violence against those who would destroy it. The operative guarding the captured staff members in Break Room 3 never saw her coming. Years of training in close quarters combat allowed Sarah to approach from his blind spot and neutralize him with surgical precision, using pressure points and anatomical knowledge that rendered him unconscious without causing permanent damage. As his body went limp, she caught him carefully and lowered him to the floor, removing his radio and weapon before zip-tying his hands with medical restraints. The captured staff members looked up in amazement as Sarah appeared in the doorway, her familiar nursing uniform making her seem like an impossible salvation. Among them was Dr. Patterson, whose night rounds she had interrupted countless times, and Janet from housekeeping, who always shared gossip during the quiet early morning hours. Their expressions showed a mixture of relief and confusion as they tried to process how their gentle colleague had single-handedly overpowered an armed terrorist. "Sarah, how did you?" Dr. Patterson's whispered question trailed off as he noticed the unconscious guard and the tactical way Sarah was positioning herself to watch both the door and the newly acquired radio. "Later," Sarah replied quietly, using medical scissors to cut their restraints. "Right now, I need you to get everyone to the basement shelter and call for military backup. Tell them we have a coordinated assault by trained operatives targeting specific patients. Do not mention that I'm still in the building." As the staff members quietly filed out toward the emergency exits, Dr. Patterson hesitated at the door. "Sarah, who are you really?" She met his eyes for a moment, and he saw something there that had never been visible during 2 years of professional interaction. The gentle nurse was still present, but underneath was someone far more dangerous and far more capable than anyone had imagined. "Someone who made a promise to protect the people in this building," she said simply. "Now go." With the staff secured, Sarah turned her attention to the radio she had taken from the captured operative. The communication traffic revealed the scope of the threat she was facing. 6 operatives total, with the team leader coordinating from the 4th floor while his subordinates prepared to extract Chen and Martinez from the surgical recovery ward. Their extraction timeline had been moved up, giving her less than 10 minutes before the targets would be removed from the building. Sarah made her way back toward the surgical recovery ward using routes that avoided the known overwatch positions. The building's architecture, which she had once navigated with the careful steps of someone focused on patient care, now became a tactical puzzle to be solved with the precision of someone trained to operate in hostile environments. The 2 operatives in the surgical ward had made a critical error in their positioning. Focused on preparing their targets for extraction, they had failed to maintain adequate security for their own positions. Sarah used their oversight to position herself in the medication storage area adjacent to the main patient rooms, where she could observe their activities while remaining undetected. Staff Sergeant Chen was barely conscious as the operatives disconnected his monitoring equipment and prepared to move him. Corporal Martinez remained completely sedated, unaware that his life hung in the balance. Both men wore the kind of serious injuries that made them completely dependent on others for survival, turning them into perfect victims for the kind of sophisticated operation that was unfolding. Sarah's mind processed multiple tactical scenarios as she prepared to engage 2 armed professionals in an environment filled with innocent patients who could not be moved to safety. The solution she settled on required the kind of precise timing and execution that had once made her missions legendary among the special operations community. The medication storage room contained everything she needed to create tactical advantages that would have been impossible in a conventional combat environment. Anesthetic gases could be released to create confusion, IV equipment could become improvised weapons, and her medical knowledge allowed her to exploit vulnerabilities that most combat operatives would never consider. The first operative never realized he was being attacked. Sarah approached from behind while he was focused on disconnecting Chen's life support systems, using a sleeper hold that combined her combat training with precise knowledge of blood flow to the brain. He collapsed soundlessly, his weapon clattering to the floor as Sarah caught it before it could alert his partner. The second operative turned at the sound of his teammate falling and found himself facing what appeared to be a hospital nurse, holding a military assault rifle with the confident grip of someone intimately familiar with the weapon. His moment of confusion as he tried to process the contradiction between her appearance and her obvious competence was all the advantage Sarah needed. "Put your weapon down and step away from the patient," she commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life-or-death situations. The operative hesitated, clearly trying to understand how a medical professional had managed to neutralize his partner and arm herself with military precision. His hand moved toward his radio, likely intending to alert the rest of his team to this unexpected development. "I said step away from the patient," Sarah repeated, moving closer with the fluid movements of someone comfortable with close-quarters combat. "You're not taking anyone from this building tonight." The operative made his choice, raising his weapon towards Sarah while simultaneously trying to reach his radio. It was a tactical error born of underestimating his opponent. Sarah's response was immediate and decisive, honed by years of training and refined by missions where hesitation meant death. The suppressed weapon fired once, placing a round with surgical precision that neutralized the threat while minimizing risk to the patients sleeping in adjacent beds. As the second operative fell, Sarah immediately moved to restore Chen's monitoring equipment and check on Martinez's condition. Both Marines were stable despite the interruption to their medical care, but she knew that the sound of combat, even suppressed, would have alerted the remaining operatives to her presence. The radio traffic confirmed her assessment. "Floor 3, respond. Status report, Floor 3. The team leader's voice carried the controlled urgency of someone who suspected that his operation was no longer proceeding according to plan. Sarah keyed the radio, modulating her voice to match the tone and cadence she had observed from the captured operative. "Floor 3 secure. Targets prepared for extraction." The deception bought her a few minutes of time, but she knew that the remaining operatives would soon discover that their teammates were no longer responding. More importantly, the team leader would expect to see his men emerge with the extraction targets according to the timeline they had established. Moving with renewed urgency, Sarah began preparing defensive positions throughout the surgical ward. Her medical knowledge allowed her to identify equipment that could be repurposed for tactical advantages, while her combat training suggested positions that would force any attackers to expose themselves while providing her with maximum cover and mobility. The elevator chimed softly as the remaining operatives arrived to check on their missing teammates. Sarah watched through the observation windows as 4 men emerged with the coordinated movements of a professional military unit. Their equipment and tactics confirmed her assessment that this was a state-sponsored operation rather than independent terrorist activity. The team leader was clearly experienced in urban combat environments, directing his men to clear the area systematically while maintaining overwatch positions that covered all possible escape routes. Sarah found herself facing opponents whose training and capabilities approached her own, making this the most challenging tactical situation she had encountered since leaving active duty. From her concealed position, Sarah observed the team's clearing procedures and identified weaknesses in their approach. They were operating under the assumption that they were dealing with hospital security or possibly local law enforcement, not a single individual with advanced special operations training. Their tactical formations were designed for conventional threats rather than the kind of asymmetric warfare that had been Sarah's specialty. The first indication that something was wrong came when they discovered their unconscious teammate in the break room. The team leader's radio chatter took on a different tone as he realized that someone with significant combat capabilities was operating against them. "We have a hostile presence in the building. Unknown capabilities. Maintain security and prepare for extraction under fire." Sarah smiled grimly at the tactical adjustment in their communications. After 2 years of civilian life, it felt strangely comforting to be facing opponents who understood the same lethal calculus that had once governed her existence. The rules of engagement were clear, and the stakes were absolute. The final confrontation came as the remaining operatives attempted to reach the surgical ward where their targets were located. Sarah had positioned herself to control the primary approach route, while maintaining escape options that would allow her to continue defending other areas of the hospital if necessary. The familiar surge of combat focus settled over her as she prepared to engage multiple opponents in close quarters. When the shooting started, it was brief but decisive. The operatives found themselves facing resistance that anticipated their tactics and responded with capabilities they hadn't expected to encounter in a civilian medical facility. Sarah moved through the engagement with the fluid precision of someone for whom combat was not just training but artistry, neutralizing threats while protecting the vulnerable patients who depended on her protection. As the last operative fell, Sarah found herself standing in the surgical ward, surrounded by evidence of the confrontation that had just concluded. The patients remained safe, the immediate threat had been eliminated, and the building was secure. But she knew that her carefully constructed civilian existence was over forever. The sound of approaching sirens indicated that the military backup she had requested was finally arriving. As she waited for them to secure the building, Sarah looked down at her nursing uniform, now marked with the evidence of combat, and reflected on the strange path that had brought her full circle from warrior to healer and back to warrior again. Dr. Patterson was among the first to return to the surgical ward, accompanied by military security personnel who were struggling to understand what had happened in their absence. He found Sarah checking on Chen and Martinez, ensuring that their medical care had not been compromised by the night's events. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I don't know who you used to be, but I'm grateful for who you became tonight." She looked up from Martinez's chart, her expression showing the same gentle competence that had characterized her nursing care for 2 years. "I'm still the same person, Dr. Patterson. I just had to remember some skills I thought I'd never need again." But even as she spoke, Sarah knew that wasn't entirely true. The quiet nurse who had changed bedpans and monitored heart rates had been real, but she had also been incomplete. Tonight had revealed that both aspects of her identity were equally authentic and equally necessary. As the military investigators began processing the scene, and the wounded Marines slowly awakened to learn that their angel had quite literally saved their lives, Sarah Mitchell finally understood that she didn't have to choose between being a healer and being a protector. Sometimes, the highest form of healing was ensuring that those who needed care lived long enough to receive it. The storm outside was finally beginning to clear, and through the windows of St. Catherine's Military Hospital, the first light of dawn was breaking across the horizon. For the Marines recovering in their beds, it represented hope and healing. For Sarah Mitchell, it marked the beginning of a new understanding of who she really was and who she was meant to be.